The evening was tense, the air thick with the kind of silence that only precedes a storm. Queen Katherine sat in her chambers, her mind a whirl of thoughts and worries. She had been warned by Chapuys, her trusted adviser, that something was amiss. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. At 9 o'clock, just as she was about to retire for the night, a sudden clamor broke the stillness. A group of men, led by the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk, burst into her chambers. The room, already dimly lit by the flickering candles, seemed to grow darker with their presence. Catherine's heart raced, but she maintained her composure, her eyes steady and calm. Norfolk, a towering figure with a stern expression, stepped forward. "We are here in the name of the king," he declared, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "His Majesty is deeply hurt and displeased by your actions. He has sent us to urge you to consider the dangers that your refusal to comply with his wishes might bring upon the kingdom." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained polite. "I am deeply regretful for any annoyance the king has experienced," she replied, her voice steady. "However, I must remind you that I have always been treated with the utmost honor and respect," Norfolk continued, his tone growing more urgent. "Surely you have no legitimate cause of complaint. The king has been nothing but fair to you. He even assisted your father in the conquest of Navarre, and you have never properly thanked him for his service." Catherine's response was swift and measured. "If my father, Ferdinand, did not have the time to acknowledge the king's assistance, it was because of his sudden death. I am deeply grateful for the king's support, but I must also stand by my conscience." Dr. Lee, a prominent scholar, then stepped forward. "You must be convinced that your marriage to the king is invalid. Your first marriage to Prince Arthur was consummated, making your second marriage to the king a detestable act in the eyes of God and the world." Catherine's expression did not waver. "You had better address your allegations to others. You will never persuade me that what you say is true. I was a virgin when I married the king, and I will not be swayed by your attempts to pressure me." The room grew even more tense as Dr. Sampson, another scholar, took his turn. "Your refusal to have the case tried and sentenced anywhere other than Rome is the reason the divorce has dragged on. You are the one causing all this delay." Catherine's resolve only strengthened. "I have endured many hard days and nights since this issue began. My first marriage and even my virginity have been questioned in front of all of Europe. I will not accept a decision on this matter unless it is made by the highest authority, the Pope." Bishop John Longland, known for his sharp tongue, spoke next. "God has shown his abomination of your union by sending down the malediction of sterility upon you. Your dead children are a testament to this." Catherine's eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I love and esteem the king as much as any woman can, but I will not remain in his company against my conscience. I know I am his legitimate and true wife, and any proofs to the contrary are false and forged." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Norfolk, trying to regain control, argued that she was not alone, mentioning Archbishop Warham and other bishops who supported her, but Catherine was quick to counter. "Those are pretty counselors indeed. When I seek advice, they all tell me they dare not help. I have been forced to send to Flanders for lawyers because no one here will or dares to draw an appeal in my favor." Thomas Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's father, finally spoke, his tone more refined than the others. "The permission to appeal does not mean the king must appear personally in Rome. If such a step is required, it is not your fault." Catherine's response was firm. "I have never sought to have the king summoned to Rome. If such a step is necessary, I cannot be held responsible." The delegation, realizing they had gained nothing, began to leave. As they filed out, Catherine looked around the room, her eyes meeting each of the men. "I am astonished to see so many high personages gathered here at such an hour, without friends or counsel, but I will not be intimidated." The door closed behind them, and the room returned to its former quiet. Catherine stood alone, her resolve as strong as ever. She knew the battle was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Henry's aggressive letter sent shivers down Catherine's spine. She confided in the ambassador Chapuys that she feared Henry had heard from Clement the Pope, that he was about to rule in Henry's favor. Chapuys, always calm and reassuring, tried to allay her fears. He told her that Henry's harsh words showed his fear and desperation, not his confidence. This helped Catherine feel better for a moment, but news from France that King Francis had persuaded the Pope to delay the divorce proceedings again plunged her into despair. Chapuys quickly wrote to her, reminding her that the Pope had never been very kind to Francis. His words brought Catherine some comfort, and she wrote back, thanking him for soothing her worries. In August, Chapuys' old friend, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, a respected scholar, wrote to support Catherine. Agrippa said he had strong arguments to prove that Catherine's marriage to Henry was valid. He suggested that Catherine ask her nephew, Emperor Charles, to have Agrippa make a public declaration in her favor. This was a small distraction from her immediate problems, like fighting Henry over where she could live. Henry had ordered her to leave Richmond and move to the moor, a drafty and isolated place in Hertfordshire. Being separated from her daughter Mary and the court, Catherine felt deeply sad and alone. Relations between Charles and Henry grew worse, and King Francis of France tried to take advantage of the situation. In October, Chapuys heard a rumor that Francis and Charles were planning to meet. Henry's counselors asked Chapuys to confirm this, and his secretary, Juan de Montoya, told them it was true. Duke Norfolk, one of Henry's top advisors, was so worried that he rushed to tell Henry. Henry was upset but tried to act confident, saying he and Francis were good friends and wouldn't do anything important without each other's consent. Norfolk even warned de Montoya that Henry would show his friendship soon, but nothing happened for 8 days. In the end, the meeting never took place and Henry was pleased. The French ambassador, Joquin, said Francis had never intended to meet Charles. By July 1531, it was clear that Bishop Fisher was Henry's biggest obstacle to divorcing Catherine. Fisher had survived an assassination attempt and continued to defend Catherine's marriage. Anne Boleyn, who wanted to marry Henry, saw Fisher as a dangerous threat. She even sent him a message, suggesting he stay away from court to avoid getting sick. But Fisher was more determined than ever to speak out against Anne and support Catherine. Catherine wrote to her nephew, telling him that Chapuys had reported the Pope might hold the divorce hearing somewhere other than Rome. This news made her very upset. She thought the Pope's hesitation was pushing Henry to break away from the Church. She feared that if the hearing was held anywhere else, judges might be bribed to rule against her. Catherine was desperate and felt that the Pope's delays were helping Henry. In late July, Henry appointed Dr. Lee and Stephen Gardiner as Archbishops of York and Winchester, giving him more control over the Church. This move was another attempt to pressure Catherine. Two men, Dr. Lee and Dr. Sampson, visited Catherine and begged her to agree to the divorce for the sake of her daughter, herself, and the kingdom. They warned her that she would be moved to even worse places if she refused. Catherine, showing great courage, knelt before them and prayed for them, asking them to persuade Henry to return to her. Her words moved some of the people present, and they spread the story of her bravery. Catherine had a strong personality. She was a victim of Henry's actions, but she was not weak. She knew how to use public displays to her advantage. Years earlier, she had led the English army against Scotland, while Henry was fighting the French. The same woman who sent her husband the Scottish king's blood-stained cloak was now kneeling before these men, but her quiet composure hid her determination. Despite her victory in this encounter, Chapuys warned Charles that Catherine would likely suffer more. He urged Charles to write to the Pope and demand action on the divorce. Henry was already living with Anne and had cut Catherine off completely. Chapuys was concerned about the toll this was taking on Catherine and her daughter, Mary. At Christmas 1531, Henry allowed Catherine a generous allowance for her own celebrations, but she was not invited to court. She sent Henry a New Year's gift, but he refused it and sent it back. Anne, on the other hand, received lavish gifts from Henry. Catherine was hurt by Henry's actions and told Chapuys that she preferred to be a prisoner in the Tower of London, where her suffering would be known to everyone. In June 1532, Chapuys reported an incident that showed the tension between Anne and her father. A young priest was imprisoned for a minor offense, and Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, asked Henry to spare him. Anne publicly rebuked her father, saying he should not speak for priests. This incident suggested that Anne, not her family, was driving Henry away from the Church. Under Thomas Cromwell's guidance, Henry continued to push the English clergy and Parliament to support him instead of the Pope. In March 1532, A document called the Supplication of the Commons was presented to Henry, listing grievances against the Church. Henry used this to demand that all clerical laws require his approval. Sir Thomas More resigned as Lord Chancellor, realizing where this was leading. In August, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, died and was replaced by Thomas Cranmer, who was more supportive of Henry's plans. Henry and his supporters now had the means to advance their cause against Rome without leaving the Church. In July 1532, Henry suddenly changed his plans for a hunting trip in the north. Chapuys heard rumors that Anne's presence had caused public outrage, but he dismissed this as just a rumor. More likely, Henry was concerned about recent Scottish raids. Later that year, Henry and Anne prepared for a meeting with Francis in Calais. Chapuys was skeptical about the French ambassador's claims that no ladies would be present. He knew that Anne was also making preparations, and there were whispers that Henry and Anne might marry in Calais. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuys had been in England for years, watching the drama of Henry VIII's court unfold. Despite the long delay, Chapuys had no real faith that the marriage between Henry and Anne Boleyn would ever happen. He was particularly alarmed by Anne's unwavering confidence. Anne seemed to be living in a world of her own making. She was so sure of her success that she wrote to one of her closest friends, possibly Anne Gainsford, asking her to prepare for an upcoming journey and meeting where Anne believed her long-held dreams would finally come true. Chapuys found this delusional, but he couldn't deny the power Anne held over Henry. Henry, always conscious of public perception, wanted to elevate Anne's status. He organized a grand ceremony where Anne was given the title of Marquess of Pembroke, a title that came with a significant income. Chapuys, who was usually uninterested in such pageantry, noted the financial details. This new title made Anne one of the highest-ranking peers in England, which annoyed Chapuys but was far less troubling than the proposed alliance between England and France. The preparations for the meeting in Calais were extensive, and Chapuys, despite being out of the loop, managed to gather detailed information. He knew that Henry and Francis I of France would meet between Boulogne and Calais, feast for 3 days, and then return to Calais, where Anne would be waiting. Henry was excited about this, and Chapuys couldn't help but notice that Henry was in high spirits, feeling that he had achieved a great success for himself and his kingdom. Anne had become a crucial figure in Henry's foreign policy, particularly in the alliance with France. With Cardinal Wolsey out of the picture, Anne was the main influence pushing for a French-English alliance. Henry and Anne hosted a banquet for the French embassy, and Chapuys, not invited, learned that Henry had bragged to the French ambassador about the Emperor Charles V's military victories. This did not sit well with the French, and Chapuys found the situation amusing. Another issue arose when it was announced that Marguerite of Navarre, who was supposed to be Anne's counterpart in Calais, was too ill to attend. Anne was disappointed, as she had known Marguerite well from her time in France. Francis I replaced Marguerite with his mistress, Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, which Henry and Anne found inappropriate. Chapuys, however, saw the irony in their complaints. Before Anne could meet Francis, she needed something more symbolic, the Queen's jewels. Henry sent the Duke of Norfolk to retrieve the jewels from Catherine, who had been Henry's first wife. Catherine, however, was not willing to part with them easily. She reminded Norfolk that the last time she gave Henry a gift, he had warned her not to do so again. She refused to hand over the jewels to someone who, in her words, was a scandal to Christendom. Eventually, under a direct command from Henry, Catherine relented. In October 1532, the English court set sail for Calais. Chapuys, left behind in London, relied on spies to keep him informed. When the court returned, Chapuys eagerly sought an audience with Henry. Henry greeted him warmly, and Chapuys, hoping to learn more about the trip, began with a safe topic, the weather. Henry confirmed that the weather had been perfect for the meeting, which was ostensibly for the good of Christendom. Chapuys was initially cautious about speculating whether the trip to France had been a cover for a secret wedding. However, rumors were already spreading, and the ambassador in Rome, Miguel May, was convinced that Henry and Anne had married in Calais. This turned out to be incorrect, but the tension was palpable. The year 1533 brought new challenges. In January, Chapuys wrote about Catherine, whose spirits had been lifted by rumors that Henry was showing signs of regret over their separation. Catherine saw this as a sign that God was intervening, but Chapuys was skeptical. He believed that if Henry was showing any signs of remorse, it was more likely due to the unpopularity of his new relationship with Anne. Chapuys suspected that Henry had already taken the next step, and it was rumored that he had married Anne in England on January 25, 1533. This was a pivotal moment, and the court was about to see the rise of new power players, Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. These men would play crucial roles in the divorce proceedings and the English Reformation, and they would eventually become victims of their own political and religious ambitions. While Chapuys was deeply involved in the drama at Henry's court, he was also a key player in a broader diplomatic game. He corresponded regularly with other imperial ambassadors, including Antoine and Nicholas Perronat, Michael Mai, Giovanni Antonio Muxicella, and Pedro Ortiz. These men, despite sharing the same goals, were often at odds with each other. Personal feuds and differing agendas made it difficult to achieve much, and Chapuys had to navigate these complex relationships carefully. The correspondence between these ambassadors offers a glimpse into their personal lives and the challenges they faced. Chapuys lost relatives to the plague, and Mai's son died suddenly in 1531. Despite the stress of their work, they maintained a level of friendship and support for each other. Chapuys' relationship with Anne Boleyn, though they met only once, was intensely personal. His resentment towards Anne stemmed from her role in the treatment of Catherine and Mary. While Chapuys could not directly criticize Henry, he focused his blame on Anne. However, it's important to note that Chapuys' reports are not entirely negative. He referred to Anne as the concubine only once in 1533, and then not again until 1535. Most of the time he called her the Lady or Lady Anne, and acknowledged her titles. The belief that Chapuys always used pejorative terms for Anne and her daughter, Elizabeth, is a misconception. He occasionally called Elizabeth the little bastard, but more often referred to her as the king's daughter or other daughter. The negative descriptions often attributed to Chapuys actually came from Pedro Ortiz, who was a passionate defender of Catherine and used terms like the concubine more frequently. Chapuys was not the only one spreading rumors about Anne. Nicholas Sander, an English Catholic priest, did more damage to Anne's reputation with his book, The Growth of the Anglican Schism, which blamed her for the break with the Church. Sander even claimed that Anne had a sixth finger, a myth that has persisted for centuries. Despite the rumors and the political drama, Chapuys remained a dedicated and observant ambassador. His reports provide a detailed and nuanced view of the Tudor court, helping us understand the complex and often contradictory nature of Anne Boleyn and the events that shaped her life. Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, often found himself in the middle of the tumultuous events surrounding King Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. While others might have been swayed by omens and signs, Chapuys was more interested in the hard facts and the political implications. He focused on whether Henry's second marriage had actually taken place, despite the threat of excommunication. In one of his reports, he mentioned that Anne had declared she would soon be married, and her father added that Henry would marry his daughter, and once Parliament approved it, it would be easier to win over opponents. In March 1533, Anne hosted a grand banquet for the king in her apartments. Many nobles, including the Duke of Norfolk and his wife, Suffolk, and Thomas Cromwell, attended. Anne sat at Henry's right, elevated above all the guests. Henry joked with Norfolk and his wife, asking if they thought Anne had a fine dowry and a rich marriage portion. Chapuys was surprised by Henry's confidence in the marriage, and was indignant that while the court feasted, Catherine and Mary were being neglected. Henry had recently forced Catherine to leave the moor and move to Ampthill, ignoring her request for more time to prepare. In late January, Thomas Cranmer returned from Germany, and was immediately appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. This appointment was unusual because it was not the custom to fill a vacancy so quickly after the previous Archbishop, Warham, had died just 5 months earlier. Chapuys knew that Cranmer was appointed to expedite the divorce proceedings by having the case heard in England. Henry claimed that the Pope was now on his side, saying Clement had told Charles that he could no longer refuse to hear the case in England. Chapuys was skeptical, and even asked Charles directly if such a conversation had occurred. Chapuys reviewed the papal brief from the previous year, which had ordered Henry to remove Anne from court. He wrote to Charles, complaining that the brief was poorly constructed and ineffective. He also subtly criticized the papal brief in his letter to Clement, suggesting that the Pope should relax the ultimatum. Chapuys believed that only a papal judgment on the divorce could resolve the issue. He heard from the papal nuncio, Borgo, that Cambrai in northern France was a possible venue to hear the divorce case instead of Rome or England. Chapuys decided to consult Catherine before making a decision. By late January 1533, it was widely believed that Henry and Anne had already married in a secret ceremony. Henry advised that he would accept a dispensation for his second marriage if Clement granted one. Pedro Ortiz, a diplomat, noted the irony that Henry was willing to seek a dispensation based on a past relationship with Anne's sister Mary, but he wanted a divorce based on a rumored relationship between Catherine and his brother Arthur. Henry claimed it was a matter of conscience, but his conscience seemed adaptable. Pope Clement harshly rebuked the English ambassador, Gregory Casale, who asked for the dispensation. Clement pointed out the contradictions in Henry's actions and questioned his conscience. Chapuys began to distrust the papal nuncio, Borgo, who denied meeting with Norfolk and Henry despite eyewitness accounts. Borgo supported the idea that the case should not be heard in Rome, which pleased Henry. This made Catherine hysterical, as she had trusted Clement to judge the matter impartially. She accused Clement of prolonging her misery and leaving her to die of grief. Chapuys wrote to Charles, urging him to push for a decision on the divorce. He warned that if Henry disobeyed the papal decision, which Catherine believed he would not, at least she and Mary would have the Pope's judgment. Catherine was too distressed to right herself, so she ordered Chapuys to do so. Clement ignored Chapuys' warnings, and the bulls for Cranmer's consecration as Archbishop arrived in late March. Henry immediately called a convocation to demand a quick decision on the divorce. The prelates were so intimidated by Henry that only Cardinal Fisher, Catherine's supporter, dared to oppose the convocation. Catherine's household was already being prepared, and many courtiers declared that the Pope would betray Charles as well. Chapuys felt that if England turned away from Rome, it would be on Clement's head. He predicted that the Pope would lose his authority in England, which would be scandalous for Christendom. Henry determined that Cranmer should preside over the divorce, and Anne's coronation was planned for after Easter. Catherine was told to accept the title of Princess Dowager, as she had held after Arthur's death. Norfolk and Suffolk visited Catherine to inform her that Henry had already married Anne, and that she must no longer call herself queen. They also warned that after Easter, Henry would no longer provide for her expenses or her servants' wages. Catherine refused to comply, declaring that she would call herself queen as long as she lived. She demanded a confessor, a physician, an apothecary, and 2 maids, and if these were denied, she would beg for alms. Chapuys was amazed at how quickly events were moving. He noted that Henry's nature had changed under Anne's influence, and he urged Charles to intervene before Anne did more damage. Chapuys sought permission to argue Catherine's case in Parliament, knowing that Henry would not allow it. When Henry refused, Chapuys retorted that Parliament could not make Mary a bastard. On Easter Sunday, Anne attended Mass, dressed in a magnificent suit of tissue, adorned with diamonds and precious stones. Her train was carried by Mary, the Duke of Norfolk's daughter, who was betrothed to Henry's illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond. Anne was now referred to as Queen in the prayers, and many were shocked by the change. Chapuys felt it was like a dream, and even Anne's supporters were uncertain how to react. As the threat of Charles invading England loomed, Chapuys needed to be handled delicately. Cromwell, who was gaining prominence, took the threat seriously and moved his valuables to the Tower. The court was in a state of panic, with Henry and his men seemingly bewildered and ready to flee at the slightest hint of war. Chapuys knew that the fears were unfounded, as Charles had not invaded despite years of urging from the ambassador. Chapuys, the loyal and determined ambassador, had reached a breaking point. Despite his unwavering commitment to Queen Katherine, the situation in England had become unbearable. Henry VIII had married Anne Boleyn, and the new queen was quickly consolidating her power. Chapuys had hoped for a recall to the imperial court, writing to Emperor Charles V. "For this cause I think I ought to be immediately recalled, and most humbly beseech your majesty to send the order." However, his request was denied, and he had to continue his difficult mission. The news only got worse when Bishop Fisher, one of Catherine's strongest supporters, was arrested and sent to the Tower. The arrest was a shock, but Chapuys suspected it was more about Fisher's defense of Catherine and the Pope than any alleged crime. Despite the rumors, Chapuys saw George Boleyn, Anne's brother, as a skilled diplomat rather than a simple courtier. George's mission to France was complex, aiming to secure an alliance against Scotland, which was becoming a threat to England. Chapuys was deeply concerned about the direction England was heading. He believed that Henry's break from Rome would lead to religious upheaval and potential rebellion. He tried to convince Charles V to intervene, emphasizing the cruel treatment of Catherine and the threat of Lutheranism. Chapuys wrote, "Considering the very great injury done to Madame, your aunt, you can hardly avoid making war upon this king and kingdom." In May 1533, Chapuys's emotional attachment to Catherine's cause led him to take a dramatic step. He visited Henry at midnight, insisting on an audience. After a tense encounter with Thomas Boleyn and the Duke of Norfolk, Chapuys was eventually granted a meeting with the king. The conversation was heated, with Chapuys accusing Henry of setting a dangerous precedent and harming his own succession. Henry, defensive and angry, snapped back, but Chapuys remained steadfast, even when Henry threatened to lose his temper. Despite Chapuys's efforts, Henry's resolve remained unshaken. The coronation of Anne Boleyn on June 1, 1533, was a stark symbol of the new order. Anne's use of Catherine's barge for the coronation procession was a deliberate insult, and Chapuys reported the incident with a mix of indignation and resignation. Norfolk, trying to maintain a balance, praised Catherine's virtues, but also suggested that she should accept Henry's divorce. Chapuys refused to agree, stating, "Even if I had, I would not for all the gold in the world undertake such a task without the express commands of your majesty." The tensions between Anne and her family continued, with Norfolk and Thomas Boleyn distancing themselves from her marriage. Chapuys, caught in the middle, remained a tireless advocate for Catherine. His dedication, while criticized by some historians, was driven by his deep respect for the Queen and his loyalty to the Emperor. Despite the challenges, Chapuys never wavered in his mission, even as the world around him changed dramatically. His story is one of unwavering commitment in the face of overwhelming odds.